Next, we are moving to our executive session. I'm seeking a motion that the board go into executive session for the purpose of discussing the character, professional competence, and physical or mental health of individuals.
So, Chair Huntsman, sorry to interrupt, but there was a report. Are you skipping that? The public ad number 18, the public ad reporting requirements.
You're absolutely right. I apologize. So let's not. I won't accept that motion. Thank you. I skipped that. I'm just got my foot on the pedal here, and this is important. So I'm sorry. I withdraw that. So item 18 is an information item on public education reporting requirements, audit update, and we have Assistant Superintendent Darren Nielsen going to share this information. I apologize, Darren. The time is yours. I don't know if you're driving the screen. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Huntsman. My name is Darren Nielsen, Assistant Superintendent of Student Learning. I will share my screen here as it's coming up. I will make a commitment. You mentioned you had your foot on the gas. I will be sensitive to that as well and try to be efficient with our time in going through this report. The Office of the Legislator General completed an audit that they conducted that took several months where they were in our office, and they published that on December 13th, 2019. My intention today is to provide an update to the status of the 9 recommendations that are contained in that audit. Your staff provided updates to the Education Interim Committee on this in August and then again in October. The October meeting with the Education Interim Committee, we were given the challenge of, or the committee was given the task of determining if the board is taking appropriate actions. I am happy to report that the committee at that time felt like the staff for the State Board of Education were taking appropriate actions related to this audit. So we'll go through these 9 recommendations, and each of these I have some supporting materials that board members and the public could find as attachments, and you'll see those. For instance, on this slide, it references the state report list. Recommendation 1 is to develop a comprehensive list of reporting requirements. Before we get into this, though, it is important to note that the audit that was published doesn't provide a clear definition of a report. It's implied and inferred based on conversations that we had with the lead auditor, Mr. Wayne Kidd, that they included any kind of element that needed to transfer between the LEA and the Utah State Board of Education as a report. So we'll talk about some of the different types of reports. And that's important to keep in context as we consider ways that we can reduce burden and streamline services with our LEAs. So the comprehensive list of state reports was completed. We continue to work on a federal reporting list. And again, that list is attached. We'll talk about some of those reports, that there are legislative actions, and these 3 bills were mentioned earlier in today's meeting: House Bill 300, House Bill 42, and House Bill 134. House Bill 42 specifically takes some of those reports that are on that state list that were provided to the legislature as options to be removed. And so there'll be a consideration of reducing that list of state reports during this legislative session. So why does it seem so challenging to get a comprehensive list of reports? On the surface, it might seem like that would be an easy task to do. Again, I want to remind those who are listening to this meeting that reports include data, finance, demographic, academic, educator licensing, all kinds of data elements that transfer from an LEA to the Utah State Board of Education. And those are all included in this concept of reporting requirements. Some of those can be transferred on a nightly basis with very little interaction between staff members, either for the LEA or for the Utah State Board of Education. And others, we don't have systems in place yet that allow that to be streamlined. Then we have what I call as plans. And I think generally the public would consider these to be meet the definition of plans. And those are things that an LEA is required to complete. Usually requires some kind of an application, also a report that talks about accountability measures that go along with that. And they're typically, if not always, they're most commonly tied with additional funding, restricted funding that's being provided either from the federal government or the Utah legislature, Utah taxpayers directly to the LEAs. So some examples are found there in that circle. Or School Land Trust, Title I for eligible schools. Charter schools have their own list, some unique ones, Teacher Student Success Act, Perkins, and etc. So our goal is to take both of those and create this master legal requirements list. In a recent communication with our lead auditor, Debbie Davis, she indicated there's over 1,600 legal requirements that our LEAs are subjected to. So recommendation number 2, to regularly review reporting requirements to ensure necessity. We've initially completed that review, and that is how some of these reports that were found in House Bill 42 came to surface. We worked through program specialists internally, and then we asked them to take that information or that request to the LEA representatives that interact with on a regular basis. And that work, again, will be ongoing, not just this year, but really in order to keep an eye on reporting and to manage that, it will be an ongoing activity. Then we get into this consideration of what's the Utah State Board of Education doing to address the data elements related to reporting. This work began long before this audit was conducted. The Utah Schools Information Management System, it's a multi-year project, and I've included in the attachments a project timeline, remembering and noting that that project timeline is subject to change as the development process for that work involves a lot of feedback from our LEAs to really establish a much improved system. In addition to that, it will be replacing, the UCIMS will replace 16 different legacy systems that don't communicate very well with one another. So if you read the audit, you'll see that there's reference to sometimes LEA representatives have to enter data in 2 different systems. The UCIMS, or the Utah Schools Information Management System, is designed to take a big leap in trying to eliminate or drastically reduce those. And it's being done by having this one system replace these 16 legacy systems that are currently being used. So this graphic helps me understand what UCIMS is. We have, I call it spending, employment, and implemented programs. You have, we call them in the agency, you teach, you learn, and you fund. Each of these work projects are designed to create, again, one system that will have a web-based portal for reporting, provide access for leadership, educators, parents, and students. And we look very excited about this system's development, the way it's being developed right now, and the hope for when it's completely finished and we're able to have full implementation and again remove those 16 legacy systems completely from our system, which will in fact reduce a great amount of duplication of effort. In addition to UCIMS, there's work within the Utah State Board of Education to promote interoperability. We know that our LEAs, many of them have their own systems, and they have the authority to make decisions about what kind of student information system they're going to have, what kind of financial system they're going to have. And so we can, as a State Board of Education, leverage interoperability principles to ensure that whatever systems an LEA purchases or chooses to implement can speak the same language as our Utah Schools Information Management System. Then we have the next recommendation, number 4, was that we develop policies to govern research and survey tools. That policy has been completed. We use Qualtrics as the primary survey tool. That in itself is a big advancement. When I came to the State Board of Education just over 3 years ago, Utah State Board of Education was very similar to the LEA that it came from. It's common to have multiple survey tools. Some people might be using a Google survey, which was free, or we had a contract with SurveyMonkey. And you would see multiple different tools being used by staff to gather information from LEAs, and it created problems, and the audit mentions that as part of their feedback to us. Moving and consolidating to one survey tool, and then instituting this policy that you can find on our website under internal policies has been a big advancement in lots of ways. And so that I'm happy to report that process is completed. Recommendation number 5 was that we accept LA's financial data in the same format as submitted to Transparent Utah. We are recommending staff that we take no action on that because of UCIMS will eliminate that concern. Recommendation number 6. This one is also a very big lift for staff and is a multi-year effort. And even beyond that will be ongoing because a lot of the individual program plans are created at the legislative level. And then they're assigned to the Utah State Board of Education to implement. So there's a need for a constant watch on and consideration of new plans and new initiatives that contain planning requirements. Obviously, those have value and they help improve the quality of these initiatives that go on, but there needs to be continual monitoring and consideration of those. And the House bills that were mentioned earlier today by Board Member Moss, Board Member Davis are designed to help with that at the legislative level. So I'm going to move to the next couple of slides. Are going to delve down into this requirement with a little more detail. This slide is really just, I didn't know how to get this across. This was shared with the legislature. I'm preaching to the choir here again today, I'm sure. This is an example of different plans that exist that contain requirements for LEAs to complete. On the left-hand side are the LEA level plans that need to be completed at the district or LEA level. On the right-hand side are school level plans. This isn't intended to be a comprehensive list. This is just me remembering plans that I had responsibility for when I worked in an LEA not that long ago. It's interesting to note too that some of these come from organizations that are placed on an LEA that don't necessarily come directly from the State Board of Education. So the Safe Routes Plan or the SNAP plan would be an example of that. It was a plan that was required for safety, transportation safety issues, but not directly through the State Board of Education. You'll see on the right-hand side, there are a couple of plans that have a line through them or a strike through. These are examples of efforts that the State Board of Education has already made to try to consolidate plans. When the Teacher Student Success Act legislation came about a couple of years ago, it included an additional plan, the Student Success Plan, and the LEA has to create a framework as well, have submitted to the Utah State Board of Education. The Utah State Board of Education worked with the bill sponsors to try to make sure that we weren't introducing a new plan. And so at that time, the School Improvement Plan, which was a requirement for all schools to complete, was removed from a legislative requirement. And the Teacher Student Success Act plan was put in place of that. So it's an example of just being attentive to the different pieces of legislation and working with people and having all the parties involved be sensitive to our LEA's time constraints. The reading plan at that same time was eliminated through legislative process because it was deemed to be unnecessary with the other plans that were put in place. So again, as an example, when we hear from the field that there's too big a burden on especially on our charter schools that don't have central office support typically, and then your small LEAs that oftentimes have 1 or 2 individuals, or their superintendent also teaches or other staff the responsibility for every one of these plans versus a large district where they might have individual staff that would be responsible for 1 or maybe 2 of these plans individually. So below our list of, if we take from that previous slide, each of those plans contain different components or elements. And staff at the Utah State Board of Education, prior to the audit, back when I first came here, had already begun taking a list of all of those plans and creating a chart that would show what requirements does every plan have. And as you look at this list, we as a staff went through it and we identified the most common elements. So a budget, for instance, is always part of the plan. But one of the other things that we found was next to budgeting, the next most common element for an LEA level plan was needs assessment or root cause analysis. So we made the decision internally at that time to begin consolidating these plans with trying to develop a consolidated needs assessment. So let's talk briefly about that. We went into design and development of that, and we set the goal internally to have a federal and state consolidated needs assessment. It is noteworthy, I think, to realize that there are only a few states in our country who have a consolidated needs assessment for federal plans. There are no examples that we could find that have a consolidated needs assessment that takes into consideration both federal plans, our title programs, the Perkins, those other federal plans that send money to our schools and districts, as well as state plans. So we're on the process of trying to create something that would be unique to our country and our educational system. To do that work, we incorporated the support from Region 15 Comprehensive Center back in February. We've included LEA representatives in that work group. There are 8 different LEA representatives in the work. 5 LEAs have volunteered to pilot the consolidated needs assessment as we get it to a place where we can roll that out. And then we hope to have that ready for statewide use following the pilot. With some of the interruptions that we've experienced this year, reassignment of our time and needs based on the pandemic, it's likely we'll have to make an adjustment on that timeline, but we still press forward and have actually a meeting with that work group again next week. So future steps, once the consolidated need assessment is completed, we hope to develop it into an online tool that includes a platform for managing financial components of the plan, to consolidate as many of those plans as possible, and really develop a system that when in the future a legislator or the state school board wants to find funding and institute a new initiative, rather than create a new plan, we point towards the consolidated needs assessment as the primary data source for determining the impact of the funding, which is really the primary purpose for most of these plans, is to try to be able to assess, did the plan have the intended outcomes, or did the funding initiative have the intended outcomes that we'd hoped it would when we allocated money for that. So that's our long-term view for that work that we're doing. And again, it's time consuming, but it's very important. And we hope that it will be very valuable in making some significant changes as we move forward. Recommendation number 7 was to select a cost-effective platform to manage a comprehensive planning approach. I mentioned on the previous slide that ideally when we get this comprehensive needs assessment built into an online platform, there would also be a way to align your funding with that. We are intentionally not working directly on that. We'll resume work on that once the comprehensive needs assessment is completed. We did review a platform, staff did in 2018, called Spark. It was a planning tool, didn't have all the components that we wanted in it. The Utah State Board of Education also already has the Utah grants application, and there's still a possibility we would be able to continue to use that, but get some adaptations made that it would meet our other needs. But at this point, we've set that off to the side until we can get the consolidated needs assessment completed. Recommendation number 8, work with the legislature to amend statutory language as necessary. It's been mentioned earlier today that the evidence of that work with the legislature, and we're appreciative of the audit because it brought sensitivity to the legislature of these challenges that our LEAs face with all of these different reporting requirements. And so there's an opportunity certainly right now. And if these pieces of legislation pass, it will put in place some structures that hopefully will help as new legislation is passed in the future. And we'll continue as representatives for the Board of Education and staff, watch those pieces of legislation and be sensitive and be the voice of caution when it comes to adding additional reporting elements. Number 9, work with the legislature to provide additional guidance for LEA's use of funding to track expenses. In 2020, there was this piece of legislation that was passed providing funding that would address this particular need. That was put on hold due to COVID-19. Representative Ballard has a bill in place. Is hopeful to reinstate the funding for that bill in this legislative session. So as we talk about, and again, today's meeting has been a good example, several places during the agenda, concerns about burdens and reporting requirements for LEAs have been brought up. It's important to note, as we talked about these 9 recommendations, there's no one action that will resolve some of these challenges that exist. But there's multiple things that we're working on behalf of the State Board of Education to accomplish the intent of the audit report, and that is to reduce the burden, reduce redundancies on our LEAs. It's also important to note that each of these reports and these requirements that have come to pass, there's somebody who believes they were important when they instituted them in the first place. So it was one of the challenges when we had staff go through the 96 state reports to say which ones might be redundant or unnecessary. Part of that challenge is where one person might believe a report is not necessary or doesn't have value, there's another individual or entity that would disagree with that. A lot of the reporting requirements, or some of them anyway, have come through audit findings. And so when a program is put in place, it's common that an audit will occur at some point in the future. And the audit oftentimes will, whether it's internal audit for the Utah State Board of Education or external audits that occur, they'll put in place recommendations that direct the State Board of Education to take action. And those usually include, in order to improve monitoring, some kind of reporting function that goes along with that. So that concludes a speedy overview of where staff are with the recommendations for the OLOG report, and I'm certainly happy to take questions.
Thank you. Board Member Lear.
I know you're anxious to move on, but I think this is maybe more important than I'm kind of realizing. I want to make sure, Darren, that I understand what a comprehensive needs assessment is. That sounds like a very slick phrase, but let me just tell you, it might be faster if I tell you what I think it is and then you correct me. Is it something that an LEA does internally to determine the characteristics of the LEA, like the number of low-income students, the mobility rate of the students, those kinds of factors, or is it something else?
That's a great question, and you've got part of it. So when we get to the place where we have fully developed a comprehensive needs assessment, we'll pre-populate those types of data elements into their needs assessment for the LEA. I also want to pause for a second and point out that there are comprehensive needs assessment requirements at the school level, especially for Title I schools. Title I schools are required annually, and to try to simplify what it means is the entity, whether it's the school or the district, the process of looking at a comprehensive needs assessment and the root cause analysis part of that is to review the characteristics of your district or your school and identify the areas of need and try to find out what is it that's causing underperformance, if we want to take that as an example, what's causing it, and then it's a tool designed to help LEAs focus their resources, develop a plan for those root causes of their, again, I'll use the word deficiencies because that's what I use as a principle, to address those needs. And put into place plans that should help me overcome those within my system.
Thanks very much. That's a real basic term that I wasn't clear about. Thank you.
Member Earl.
Thank you. My question has to do with maybe the security of the data and such, and specifically who has access outside of the state of Utah? Do we have, in other words, are there federal organizations that are going to be able to access our data, or is that on as per, like, for example, Title I funding and such? Do we send them the data, or I'm just wondering how expansive this becomes for other organizations outside of Utah to access all of our data. I know we want to easily do grant monies and other funds so that we should communicate things, but still keeping that information secure on our teachers and on our students.
Yeah, great question. Remember, Earl, The comprehensive needs assessment is a tool that's designed for internal use. There are data elements that are transferred between the LEA and the U.S. Department of Education, and also from the SEA to U.S. Department of Education. The comprehensive needs assessment doesn't change any of those. It's again designed to organize data that we already have from the LEAs housed at the Utah State Board of Education, pre-populate that into a tool that allows them to more easily understand and digest not just the quantitative data, but the qualitative data associated with their school community or their district community, and then make decisions about that will help them develop plans and programs that can support continuous improvement within their environment.
Okay, so I just along that lines, if that's, can I ask another question along that lines?
Follow up.
So I guess my concern is that other organizations coming in and saying this is how you need to do your program versus you know, the LEA keeping that information in a way that they can use. So I guess it just depends on the organization, maybe. Is that what I'm understanding and what the intended use is?
Yeah, so let me restate what you're saying so I can see if I'm connecting with your question. When funding comes into a school or a district, there's often restrictions placed on that funding, and that can be by the federal government, U.S. Department of Education, or state government, State Board of Education. And those entities generally require some kind of accounting or report based on that funding. What we're working on within this, our efforts to reduce and consolidate reporting doesn't affect those constraints or those restrictions that are placed on the funding. We're simply trying to, in those that already exist, we're not creating new ones or changing the structure with which how data is transferred between those entities, whether it's the U.S. Department of Education in the school or district or the state Department of Education. Our goal or objective is designed to create a system or a process that supports their ability to digest all of that information, see that it should, how they can direct it to their greatest academic and social and other needs that they have within their school community, and implement, make their own plans. Again, it's not designed, this work isn't designed to change who has authority to make decisions about the use of those funds. It's really about creating a system that's more easy to use and is more supportive of that continuous improvement.
Okay, I think that answered. It is the authority part that I guess is a little concerning if we're not careful, someone else directing that. So thank you.
So to that question really quick, Darren, so there isn't new pathways of moving data outside of what we already have in those requirements at all. It's those, I want to call, when I say the pathway, that's the chain of command and how data is shared. It's just how it is today, and you're not proposing anything outside of that. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Let me give you an example. So it's not uncommon if we go back to that list of plans that we'll say to an LEA, we give them they have a plan, they have some kind of application they have to complete. We give that to them, and then we say to them, you fill in X, Y, and Z. And they say, because I was there, I remember saying this, why do I have to provide this to the state? They've already got it out of my UTREC submission, and now I have to submit, let's use gifted and talented as example. Now I have to go back and identify how many kids were in AP classes, how many were concurrent enrollment, how many of those kids demonstrated proficiency on their end of level test. And I would say to myself, why am I doing this when they already get that through UTRECs? So the consolidated needs assessment, especially when we get it in an online format, would pre-populate. This is something the LEA representatives who are part of our work would be really excited about. It pre-populates it. Again, it's not an external system. So in terms of data privacy, which is something we all have concerns and sensitivity about, there's no changes in that because the access to that data is still between the LEA or the school and the State Board of Education. But it's putting it into a format and a system that allows it to be more efficiently digested by the LEAs.
Thank you. Board Member Moss.
Thank you, and thank you, Superintendent Nielsen, for that detailed report and explanation. That's very helpful. As you know, I've been listening to the folks on that group who were very respectful of the purpose for these reports, and knowing that each one of them, as you indicated, had a reason that was designed to make sure we know what's going on, and that the funding or authorities being used to help kids. One question that came up was kind of the flow through of the impetus for a new data information requirement, whether that's a report, an audit. And I know these are all over the place. So I have just a tighter question without asking. Some of it came up as kind of a guttural, where is this coming from? So to try to tighten that down, could you just explain kind of the authorization piece when a division, for example, in response to an audit or a federal or state requirement or a board rule, decides that a new information request is necessary and rolls that out to the LEAs? Is that up to each division? Does that go through you? Does that go through the superintendent to get approval for that? Or are they autonomous in the ability to say, we need this new, data gathering request?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm gonna break it into two parts, just the way that I think about things. If it's a data gathering request related to a requirement to board rule, then obviously that goes back through you as a board. The staff can't institute a requirement without the board authorizing that. On the other side of that coin, we have, we talked about in the slides, the survey tool. So on the other side, we do have times where staff will have a need for some information to help make decisions about programs, for example. Previous to the Qualtrics policy, those decisions could be made independent of one another. So you might find an LEA, and I can't give you a specific example, but I'm sure it happened where maybe I say, hey, I need some information about school principals, and I create a survey and send it out to school principals. And then somebody in teaching and learning says, hey, we've got we need to find out something about school principals. And so they send out a survey, maybe in the same month or in the same year anyway. And so under those conditions, previously, your point is right, that individual sections or staff could seek information from different entities. With the Qualtrics policy, that's been centralized. And so there's within that policy, there's a process to get to a lead point that will evaluate a request that comes in that believes they need information from some entity within our educational community in the state, looks at other data gathering efforts that have been done to see if we can just get that information that's already been submitted. And then there's that process to eliminate this possibility that staff are sending out requests for information separate from one another without knowing what each other's gathering. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And would a gathering, if I could just quick follow up, Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned if it's board generated, it comes back through the board. If it's as you describe, a survey or other information gathering tool that might be internal, when it's statutory, when it comes down from either federal or state statute, some of which have been in place for a while and others are new, what's the kind of checkpoint on those information requests?
Yeah, so when you say checkpoint, do you mean a control that would determine whether it's appropriate or not?
Right, yeah, there you go, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. My understanding is that would come again through the board. A decision that the board would make is as you take a statutory requirement and fold it into a rule, an associated rule to oversee the implementation of that, or if as a board you'd create a new program or unique program within that board rule is where we should find anything that's required of the LEA. So the example we have early on these slides in that list of 96 state reports, if you were to look through there, you'll see that those reports are all, those requirements are in statute or board rule. So they're determined at the policy level.
Thank you very much.
Board Member Hart.
I'm just, so I want to make sure I understand, Darren. So after we have a consolidated needs assessment, that would then be substituted for needed data on reports that would be asked for by USBE? Because without that, it sounds like another report.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you were to see where we're at with it, you'd say, oh man, this looks like it's pretty large. If you remember the list that we showed of, if we take that, if we went back to that picture, all these different plans, and each of them independently requires some type of needs assessment to be completed, or many of them do. The goal with the consolidated needs assessment is once we've completed that, then we could go back and have the structure in place to eliminate multiple legislative requirements around a needs assessment. So again, LEAs do that one time, not annually either, probably one time every 3 or every 5 years. That works still, that recommendation is still being developed. And so then you can, once that's in place and that requirement that exists in multiple plans is there, we can consolidate the actual plans that are in statute or board rule, is the hope.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Darren, I'm not seeing any other hands up, but I appreciate the work on this. There's an awful lot of work that's gonna continue to happen here, and in the space of moving, I don't think we'll get to perfection, but we certainly want to bring those betterments forward to minimize this reporting. So I appreciate your efforts there. Do you have any concluding remarks on your presentation?
No, thank you, Chair and board members, for your time. And again, I would like to point out, you're correct, Chair Huntsman. This is a lot of work with a lot of people. It'll take time to get through it, but hopefully today you've seen that there's been successes already, and we're making progress at a pretty good pace, especially considering the disruption to all of our schedules and responsibilities over the last almost 12 months now. And so we can provide updates on this work as often as you would like. And we expect to continue to see progress down this road.
Okay, thank you.